American picker, Mike Wolfe.
I've still got that. You need to buy that. I need to buy that.
Antique stores are generally home for relics of the past.
Mike Wolfe built a life out of chasing forgotten treasures. From barns in Iowa to attics in Georgia, he turned rusty gold into a television empire and became a household name in the process. For over 15 years, millions of us watched him and Frank Fritz crisscross the country, swapping jokes and uncovering pieces of America's past.
The U.S. Sun has obtained first photos of Mike days after the passing of his beloved friend and longtime co-star, Frank Fritz.
But now, things have taken a turn no one saw coming. The show isn't what it used to be. The partnership is gone. And behind the scenes, Mike has made a decision that changes everything. Not just for him, but for the future of American pickers. Stick with us, because the reasons behind his choice might surprise you more than the decision itself.
So, we've been very blessed. We've had the same crew for 13 years. And so everybody I work with was very close to Frank.
The golden years we all remember. If you think back to those first years of American pickers, especially around 2010 to 2016, it's almost impossible not to smile. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz weren't just hunting down antiques. They were basically inviting us along on their road trips. You'd see them digging through barns, laughing at the strangest finds, and competing to see who could get their hands on the oddest old bike or rusted sign. The whole thing felt effortless, like watching two lifelong buddies who had turned their inside jokes and shared passion into a full-time adventure. Mike was the big dreamer, always pushing for the next great score, while Frank was the guy who kept things grounded with his humor and no-nonsense outlook. Together, they struck this perfect balance that just worked. And fans noticed. Those early seasons weren't just mildly successful, they were pulling in millions of viewers every single week. Think about that. Millions of people tuning in to watch two guys rummage through attics, garages, and backyards. But it wasn't really about the rusty gas pumps or the Coca-Cola signs, was it? It was about the chemistry. Their banter was sharp, funny, and, most importantly, it felt real. Nothing about it seemed staged, which is rare for reality TV. What made it even more special is that the friendship wasn't just for the cameras. Behind the scenes, Mike and Frank were really living that life. They were driving endless miles in packed vans, sharing cheap meals at roadside diners, and staying in motels that had seen better days. They didn't know if anyone would even care about this little show about junk, but they believed in it, and they believed in each other. That belief paid off. By the third season, they weren't just recognizable faces on TV. They were signing autographs, meeting fans in parking lots, and suddenly living out a version of the American dream that most people only imagine. Mike and Frank had gone from small-town Iowa pickers to household names, and everyone loved the idea that two regular guys could make it big just by chasing what they loved. But here's the thing, success has a funny way of changing everything. Even when a friendship feels unshakable, little cracks can form. By 2017, some of those cracks started to show, and fans began to wonder if everything was really as perfect as it looked. That's where things started to get complicated. Hairline cracks nobody saw. You probably remember the first time Frank missed an episode. At first, it was easy to brush off. He'd had back surgery, and anyone who's gone through something like that knows it's not a quick or painless recovery. But after that, more absences started to stack up. A shoulder issue kept him home for a stretch, then hip problems. Before long, you'd tune in and realize Frank was gone for weeks at a time. Mike, always the steady hand, kept the show moving, but something felt different. Those quick jokes and natural back and forth that defined the early years started to sound a little forced, almost like Mike was trying to fill the silence that Frank used to carry so naturally. And the fans noticed. Ratings, which had once hovered around 3 million viewers per episode, in the early seasons, slowly began to slide. 2 million tuned in, then 1.5. On social media, viewers started asking the same question over and over again. Where's Frank? Some even accused Mike of hogging the spotlight, even though the reality was more complicated than that. The History Channel tried to calm the storm with official statements, chalking Frank's absences up to health issues. Technically true, but it wasn't the full story. Behind the cameras, things were a lot tougher. After losing his mother in 2014, Frank went through a difficult stretch. Friends and crew members who had worked with him for years said his drinking became harder to ignore. He'd show up looking tired and swollen, sometimes forgetting lines or snapping at people on set. For a guy who had always been quick with a joke and easygoing charm, it was jarring. Mike, who had built the American Pickers brand from scratch, found himself in a tricky spot. He worried about the show, of course, but he also worried about Frank as a friend. Some say he even offered to pay for rehab and encouraged Frank to take real time off instead of just pushing through. But if you've ever dealt with someone going through that kind of struggle, you know how stubborn pride can be. Tension built, arguments happened, and before long, the easy friendship that had once looked unshakable started to fracture. By the time the world shut down in early 2020, Mike and Frank hadn't shared the road in months, and insiders say their conversations had grown cold, clipped, and full of sharp edges. The public breakup. By the summer of 2021, things finally boiled over in a way fans couldn't ignore. Frank, who had been quiet up to that point, gave an interview where he laid out what had been happening. He explained that he hadn't spoken with Mike in 2 years and felt like he had been left behind after his back surgery. For longtime viewers, that was a pretty big gut punch, because to most people watching at home, their friendship always looked like it could survive anything. Suddenly, fans were realizing there was more going on behind the scenes than anyone had guessed. Not long after that, the History Channel confirmed that Frank wasn't coming back to American Pickers. That one announcement split the fan base right down the middle. You had folks who were loyal to Frank, saying the show wasn't worth watching without him, and others who stuck by Mike, pointing out that he was the one still putting in the miles and carrying the brand forward. Online discussions turned into heated debates, with every new episode being dissected in Facebook groups, Reddit threads, and fan pages. Mike tried to keep the momentum alive. He leaned on Danielle Colby, who had been with them since the start, and gave her more screen time. His brother Robbie became a regular, and they brought in people like Jersey John to keep the episodes moving. The effort was there, and the new faces brought different perspectives, but if you ask most longtime fans, it just didn't feel the same. The spark that came from Mike and Frank bouncing off each other couldn't really be recreated, no matter how hard they tried. Viewership numbers reflected that change. At the height of its popularity, American Pickers was pulling in close to 3 million viewers per episode. By the time Frank's absence was permanent, those numbers dipped under 1 million. That's still respectable for cable, but nowhere near the powerhouse it once was. Antique shop owners who used to line up hoping for a visit now admitted that the excitement had cooled, and merchandise sales weren't what they used to be either. Mike kept grinding, filming season after season, but the reality was hard to ignore. The show had lost the easy chemistry that once made it so addictive. Stroke, reconciliation, and the last gift. You know, life has this weird way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. For Frank Fritz, that moment came in July of 2022 when word got out that he'd suffered a pretty serious stroke at his farmhouse in Iowa. Paramedics had to rush in, and when they found him, the situation was bad. He was left paralyzed on his left side, couldn't really move, and, even more heartbreaking, he couldn't speak. For a guy who made a career out of talking, laughing, and connecting with people in barns and backyards all across America, that was just devastating. The news spread quickly online, and the reaction was immediate. Fans who'd been divided during the whole fallout with Mike Wolfe suddenly put all that aside. It wasn't about Team Mike or Team Frank anymore. It was about someone they genuinely cared about going through the fight of his life. Social media was full of prayers, memories, and people sharing old clips of Frank cracking jokes on American Pickers. It was almost like the world collectively remembered just how much joy he had brought over the years. Now, here's the part that really surprised a lot of people. Mike, who at that time was busy filming down in Tennessee, didn't hesitate. He hopped on a private plane as soon as he heard what had happened. And when he walked into the hospital ICU, he didn't bring the usual stuff you'd expect. No flowers or fruit baskets. Instead, he carried a plain brown paper bag. Inside were 2 cold Miller Lights, Frank's favorite, and an old Polaroid photo of the two of them leaning against a 1939 Harley-Davidson they'd found together back in 1998. When Mike walked into that room, Frank's eyes lit up. Even though he couldn't talk, that spark was still there. Imagine spending years not really speaking to your best friend, only for everything to come flooding back in a single moment. Mike grabbed Frank's hand, the one he could still move, and it was like all the unspoken apologies and regrets of the last few years were hanging there between them. That's not something cameras can ever really capture. From that point on, Mike made it a priority to be there for Frank during his recovery. Every week he visited, and he didn't just sit around making small talk. He brought cheeseburgers when hospital food got old. He played old VHS tapes of their earliest pics when they were just 2 guys with a van chasing treasures. And sometimes he'd just sit there, keeping Frank company. Even though Frank couldn't say much, he laughed in his own way, and you could tell those moments meant the world to both of them. Then, in March of 2023, something incredible happened. After months of therapy and struggle, Frank managed to say his first full sentence since the stroke. It wasn't long, and it wasn't polished, but it was pure Frank. He looked at Mike and rasped out a line about how they'd found some pretty amazing stuff over the years. And that one sentence, as simple as it was, carried so much weight. It was like the floodgates opened, and all those years of friendship that had seemed broken were suddenly mended in a single moment. The rehab staff, who'd been watching this bond rebuild in real time, were emotional too. It wasn't just about Frank's recovery, it was about forgiveness, about putting the past behind them, and about realizing what really mattered. But, of course, recovery after a stroke isn't easy. Frank fought hard, and fans kept sending messages of support. But life doesn't always give us the ending we hope for. On September 30th, 2024, more than 2 years after his stroke, Frank's body finally gave out. The news hit the American Pickers community hard. For fans who had followed his journey from the very beginning, it felt like the end of an era. Mike was devastated. Instead of posting some long statement, he shared a single photo online, his hand holding Frank's, taken in those final moments. The caption was short and simple, just a goodbye to his partner and his friend. And honestly, it was probably the most powerful thing he could have done, because sometimes pictures speak louder than paragraphs ever could. The History Channel quickly put together a tribute episode. It was a mix of classic clips and behind-the-scenes moments, showing Frank at his funniest, his quirkiest, and his most passionate. Fans watched with tears in their eyes, remembering all those times he'd made them laugh or taught them something new about history hidden in plain sight. What really stood out, though, was how fans created their own memorials. People left beer cans and little toy motorcycles at Frank's old farmhouse fence. Others posted pictures of their favorite episodes or of times they'd actually met Frank at flea markets or antique shows. It wasn't just mourning a TV personality, it was mourning a guy who genuinely connected with people. For Mike, the loss cut deep. Sources close to him said he even spent a couple of weeks at Frank's farmhouse after the funeral, sleeping on the porch, almost as if he couldn't let go. He'd sit under the stars, telling stories to the night sky, drinking beer, and always leaving one bottle unopened, like he was saving it for Frank. That image alone shows just how real their friendship was, beyond all the drama and TV cameras. And somewhere in those quiet nights, Mike realized he couldn't just go back to business as usual. The thought of filming another season of American Pickers without Frank didn't feel right anymore. The show had been their shared dream, and even though it could technically go on, the heart of it was gone. Mike Wolfe's sentence is final. A lot of people assume Mike Wolfe will eventually bounce back. That's the pattern we've all seen, right? Something happens, things look shaky, but then he gets back on the road, finds another amazing barn full of treasures, and suddenly it feels like nothing ever changed. That's how fans picture him. As a survivor, a hustler, the guy who could see value where no one else could, turning what he called rusty gold into an empire. And for years, that was true. But if you've been following closely, you can see this moment feels completely different. It's not just a pause, not just a short pit stop to refuel before he jumps back into another season. This really looks like he's taking a different route altogether, one that doesn't lead back to the familiar world of American Pickers. Mike himself has admitted as much. In a rare interview not long ago, he opened up about what life has been like since Frank left the show. He said that when Frank was gone, it felt like being the last man standing, like suddenly the person who had been beside him for decades just wasn't there anymore. And that's a tough thing to process because theirs wasn't just a work relationship. They had the kind of friendship where they could finish each other's sentences. Mike even described it in his own way, saying that as a left-handed guy, having Frank around made him feel ambidextrous. That's a powerful way to explain how much balance Frank brought into his life. Losing Frank's friendship at that time wasn't just about the show. Mike said it felt like losing a brother, and that made it incredibly painful to hear some of the things Frank said publicly during those rocky years. But even then, he didn't hold on to bitterness. He recognized that those words were coming from a place of hurt, from someone dealing with struggles that weren't always visible to everyone else. And maybe that's one of the reasons Mike has chosen not to chase the spotlight as aggressively anymore. When you've lived through something like that, the highs of success and the lows of losing someone who's been in your corner for decades, it shifts your perspective. That shift is obvious when you look at the choices he's been making recently. For instance, in April of 2025, he made the surprising decision to close the antique archaeology shop in Nashville. For years, that store wasn't just a business. It was almost like a pilgrimage site for fans of the show. Tourists would line up, hoping to see Mike or Danielle in person, snapping photos with the old motorcycles and neon signs. But Mike sold the building to a bourbon distillery, which feels pretty fitting if you think about it. Still a very American tradition, just a different kind of spirit, literally. From all accounts, he only kept a single box of items for himself, not because they were worth a lot of money, but because they meant something to him personally. That tells you everything about where his priorities are now. The original antique archaeology store in LeClaire, Iowa, is still standing, though. That one's close to his heart. It's his hometown, his roots. The shop still opens, but only on limited hours these days, run by the staff he's trusted for years. It's quieter, slower, more about staying connected to the community than making headlines. It's a shadow of what it used to be in terms of crowds and sales, but maybe that's the point. Now, technically, Mike still owns the rights to the American Pickers name. The History Channel has a contract that gives them first dibs if he ever decides to bring it back. But, let's be honest, from everything insiders have been saying, that's more of a formality than a real possibility. The network might hold out hope, but the reality is, Mike seems done with that chapter of his life. He's channeling his energy into new, unexpected projects that show a completely different side of him. He's been working on a thriller film called Day of Reckoning, where he plays a small-town sheriff guarding some kind of dangerous secret. That's a far cry from bargaining over rusty gas pumps or vintage signs, right? It's a whole different lane for him, and fans are curious to see what he can do as an actor. On the other end of the spectrum, he's also written a children's book that's set to come out in the fall of 2025. It's about a rusty old bicycle that learns it's still valuable, even though it doesn't look shiny and new anymore. And if you think about it, that's kind of a metaphor for Mike's own story. Finding worth and meaning in things, and in himself, beyond just what's on the surface. But here's the thing. If you're trying to track Mike down these days, you're not likely to find him on a film set or at a press event. Instead, he's been spending his mornings out on the Mississippi River near LeClaire. Picture him in a beat-up aluminum fishing boat with his teenage daughter and some of her friends, just enjoying the quiet. He leaves his phone in the truck on purpose so he can be fully present, and they just fish, talk, and soak in the calm. For a guy who spent decades chasing deals on the road, always one phone call away from the next big pick, that's a major lifestyle change. It's like he's finally choosing the sunrise over the spotlight and the simple moments with family over the endless grind of filming. Life after the van. Mike Wolfe hit 59 in June of 2025, and unlike the milestone birthdays you sometimes see splashed across celebrity magazines or turned into a big PR event for TV personalities, his was about as low-key as it gets. No producers with clipboards, no giant cake shaped like a motorcycle, and definitely no press releases. Instead, he spent it the way a lot of regular folks would want to, in his backyard with a bonfire going, surrounded by the handful of people he's closest to. They roasted marshmallows, swapped stories, and kept the phones mostly in their pockets. The only reason fans even got a glimpse was because his daughter shared a single photo a couple of days later. It wasn't staged or glossy, it was just Mike, hair a little messy, hoodie on, smiling at the fire. If you followed his career from the days when everything was cameras and road trips, that one photo said a lot about where he's at now. And in this quieter chapter of his life, he's also found room to start dating again. The person he's with now isn't part of the TV world or the antique business, which probably explains why it works. She's a physical therapist he met back when Frank was going through rehab after his stroke. Their connection grew from shared time in that space, and it stayed grounded because it's built around normal day-to-day life rather than the constant whirlwind of travel and production schedules. Friends who've seen them together say it's comfortable and easy, and for Mike, that seems to be exactly what he was looking for. Something steady, supportive, and far removed from the pressures of public life. Outside of relationships, he's picked up a new hobby that caught a lot of people off guard: welding sculptures out of scrap metal. It's not something he's doing for galleries or to sell to collectors. It's more about keeping his hands busy and his creativity flowing. After years of chasing the next big find for the show, he's enjoying the chance to make things for himself without thinking about price tags or episodes. Some of the pieces are abstract, some resemble animals or bikes, and he's admitted to friends that he likes how it reminds him of his early days tinkering in garages before the fame hit. Of course, he hasn't completely walked away from picking. That's something he said will probably always be in his blood. The difference now is that he does it in a much quieter way. Instead of the big cross-country runs in a van with a film crew, it's more like stopping by a small estate sale on a Saturday morning or poking around a neighbor's barn when someone mentions they've got old tools collecting dust. The finds these days are smaller, items that can fit in the trunk of his Subaru instead of requiring a trailer. He'll flip some of them online under a pseudonym. Just another anonymous seller on Facebook Marketplace. No fanfare attached. And here's the part that really speaks to where his priorities have shifted. The money doesn't go into his pocket. Every sale, no matter how small, gets donated to stroke rehab charities. It's his way of keeping Frank's memory close and turning the hobby that built his career into something that helps people going through struggles similar to his old friends. When you put all of that together, the family time, the private relationship, the new hobby, the low-key picking, and the charity work, it paints a picture of a guy who finally figured out how to slow down. After decades of living on the road and chasing ratings, Mike Wolfe seems to be living at a pace that actually lets him breathe. It's not about walking away from the past, it's more like reshaping it so the parts that mattered most, the friendships, the creativity, and the love of the hunt, stay alive without all the noise that used to come with them. And honestly, looking at him now, roasting marshmallows with his daughter, or tinkering in his workshop with a welding torch, it feels like this might be the most authentic version of Mike we've ever seen. Not the TV character, not the businessman, just a guy from Iowa who still loves old stuff, still values his roots, and is finally content with the quieter road ahead. Tell us in the comments below what your favorite Mike and Frank moment is. And if you want more videos that go deeper than the headlines of your favorite celebrity and get to the real human stories, then hit subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss what we post next.